Ryan, a lecturer in the Department of Disability and Education at Liverpool University. Due to my feminist disability studies research, specifically surrounding representations of disabled women in advertising and examining how disabled women draw on their embodied experiences when navigating advertisements, I was delighted to be invited by Professor Bolt to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Tanya Titchkosky. Professor Titchkosky is a leading scholar in the field of disability studies and is part of the Department of Social Justice Education at the University of Toronto. She is an editorial advisor for the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies and over the years has joined us for several CCDS events at Liverpool Hope. Professor Titchkosky's work, which is influenced by feminist theory, queer theory and black studies, contributes to the dismantling of boundaries between academic/activist work, disability theory/everyday experiences of disability, and personal/political realms. In her 2011 book, The Question of Access, Professor Titchkosky defines disability studies as an academic, activist, and artistic endeavour. Accordingly, her substantial contributions to the field invite us to move beyond straightforward approaches to disability and access, and to embark on more imaginative processes of reflecting on, re-engaging with, and redefining the meaning surrounding disability and access that are already available to us. So here I have drawn directly from Professor Titchkosky's most recent book, The Question of Access. It is also important to note that Professor Titchkosky is the sole author of two other books, Reading and Writing Disability Differently, The Textured Life of Embodiment, Disability Self in Society, and is the co-editor of Rethinking Normalcy, a disability studies reader. I would also like to note that Professor Titchkosky has provided some large print versions of her presentation, which I'm happy to hand round if anyone would like one. And she has asked me to also make you aware that after Tanya has finished her speech, the Q&A, the camera will be turned off for the Q&A. Now, without further delay, I would like for you all to join me in warmly welcoming Professor Titchkosky.
Ella, thank you. That was such a beautiful... I'd love to live up to that description. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Tanya. Thank you for letting me do this keynote, David Bolt. Your conference every year really inspires me and many of the people I work with and have supervised, and we're really happy to be here again. And it's been a great time, and the papers I've heard have also been great. My paper is called Strange Weather, a Disability Studies Forecast. And I want to add something to the idea that disability studies can help us think about our current crisis, or what it means to be human beings in crisis. I'm also going to try and use a PowerPoint. Those of you who know me, I don't do this. No, that's not how I do it. Oh boy. Oh, on the screen, there's going to be, when things appear on the screen, it's typically quotations that I'm going to be using. But instead of trying to depict how we are beings in crisis right now, I put up a 4-panel cartoon. I thought we might describe the 4-panel cartoon a little bit together. It's in each panel, it says the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s. And there's, would anybody like to describe what they see there? It might be a man. It appears to be a man, very large nose. He appears to be white. He's talking to someone who's very little, who might be a child, by a garbage can. And panel 1, is there anything I'm not seeing in the slide that you would like to mention?
The title.
The title. It's that easy. Thank you, Patty. Anything else going on? Pretty pale colors. It's, oh yes. They're very short. Panel 1. Pick up your litter and save the earth, says the bigger character to the little character. In the 90s, recycle and you can save the earth. In the 2000s, reduce your carbon footprint and you can save the earth. And at this point, they have a bicycle behind them and they're wearing a bike hat. And then we get to current times, or so almost. Completely restructure global economic systems and you may be able to save a remnant of humanity. That's instead of any big proofs. You get this to wiggle our imaginations. And I might not be using the PowerPoint if I don't figure this out. Can someone give me a lesson again?
Arrow key to the right, maybe?
Try pushing escape from the top left.
Escape.
Yeah.
Ah! Okay. Here we go. Quote, a drop of rain hit my nose. My lenses was all misted, but I see it clear. The jagged crescent of light ripping through the center of the sky. The clouds was all gone now. I finally started to have second thoughts. Was I really expecting to finish this journey with my body intact? I suppose I should have watched the weather forecast before jumping into this. Ain't many times I've been a man without a plan, but that's why this expedition was feeling so good. I decided I had come too far to turn around. End quote. We, like the nameless character in Hosin's Commonwealth Award-winning story, do not make it out with our bodies intact. And we have come too far to turn around from the necessity of engaging the complex meanings that arise between the weather and our bodies. Moreover, future forecasts and plans are not the only thing to worry about, since there is the question of what our current relations might teach us about how people already make weather strangely meaningful. Even though climate change deniers still capture media attention, it is, says Brian Wynn in 2010, quote, entirely plausible that existing scientific representations of climate change and its human causes may understate the risks induced by prevailing social economic processes rather than exaggerate them, end quote. Still, when all signs point to climate change and correct ways of conceiving of it, strange weather can become a singular story, resulting in reductionist debates of confirmation or denial, or simply a pessimistic pronouncement of, it's too little, it's too late. In denial, in acceptance, and in everything in between, there remains us, disabled people and allies, being weathered beings, and all our explicit worries about this. Serving as the everyday basis of small talk, or as the core rumblings forming complete narrative trajectories of setting, plot, character development, and the symbolic. The force of the weather is a powerful cultural phenomenon, provoking critical engagement that opens our imagination at the nexus of bodily variation and climate change. Let us call this nexus strange weather. For the weather does not just happen, it happens through our interpretation. Strange the rain is today, or I guess strange to see the sun. And any interpretation is the meeting point of our enworlded and embodied selves. This worldly relation to the act of interpretation is held to be true for some forms of narrative literary inquiry, for critical indigenous studies, phenomenology, Black and queer and trans studies, as well as feminist theorists. I'm going to draw on bits of all of those today as I move this into disability studies. Thus, that drop of rain that hits my nose should give us much to consider, at least from a disability studies perspective, informed by those traditions just mentioned, which commit to an interpretive turn. The lens may be misted, and there are innumerable ways the body may deliver a sense of, I can't. The legs may be weary, the arms might be sore, the body may not move, the words will fail us, and the mind can skip and pause. And yet, a drop of rain does hit my nose, and hits it in my particularity. The rain hits me in the movement of its feel encountered differently when I move in it with dyslexia alone, or with my blind partner, or with other disabled comrades. In any of these occasions, the question of whether I have seen or read correctly is provoked by the rain. Of course, the rain cannot raise this question verbally, and maybe it does not raise it alone, but it always does raise it. Strange weather. Has the bump, the pothole, turn, intersection, street sign been read in the way that our movement in the rain requires? Or in the way that our futures together in crisis require? Still, unlike the one drop of blood used to reforge a racist schemata, this one drop of rain can hit anyone, indiscriminate, yet still unequal, since not everyone is put to question by the rain. Existing at the nexus of strange weather and being weathered beings is given powerful symbolic expression in Catherine Frazie's work. I'm flipping. No, I'm not. There we go. I've put on the screen just the words I'm going to use from Catherine Frazee. Frazee is distinguished professor and founder of the Ryerson University Disability Studies School that's in Toronto, Canada. She is past chair of the Ontario Human Rights Commission and author of numerous articles, including Disability in Dangerous Times. And that article she delivered at OISE, my place of work, in a particularly dangerous time. It was 2008, I believe. Disability studies was under threat, student funding was under threat, and the sense of what was happening in the environment was becoming more and more poignant. In Disability in Dangerous Times, she includes a narrative of her morning routine with her assistant. She says, "I am naked and the waters are rising. A woman leans in toward me, presses, pulls, turns. Her touch is sure and linen crisp. I am naked, she is not. We repeat this encounter every day. Sometimes we talk. The years have made friends of us. On this day, like everyone else, we are talking. It is the summer of 2005. The levees have failed, and the bodies of 34 drowned residents have been found in what remains of St. Rita's nursing home in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana." End quote. On this day, Frazie's PA, Shelley, in Canada, is outraged that the PAs in Louisiana are being blamed for the deaths of the disabled residents in the nursing home. And Shelley is busy telling Catherine Frazee exactly this, that she would go home to her children and wouldn't be caught still at work during a storm. Frazee, in the bath and receiving Shelley's touch, says that, quote, "While I'm a safe distance of over 2,000 kilometers from those broken levees, I could still feel the waters rising," end quote. Frazee could feel as well her own staggering, quote, "failure of empathy in relation to those workers whom Shelley had championed," end quote, while also noting that this weather event, like all others, goes far beyond the identification of villains and victims. Frazee reminds us that, quote, "catastrophe stalks by category, and disabled people figure prominently on its radar," end quote. Any disability studies forecast needs to include attention to these failures of empathy as they point to our sense of collusion. According to Frazee, this sense is one that perceives how we are, quote, "colluding with the larger forces of power and structure and governing relations that constitute the stage upon which the characters, including ourselves, are performing our parts," end quote. Failures of empathy are best read as methodological moments, pointing to our acts of collusion, at least in the indiscriminate yet unequal strange weather scene. Within weather narratives, such as depictions of climate change itself, we encounter power and the existential strangeness of our weather stage, set up by pre-existing governing relations of which we are a part. Weather, indiscriminate and unequal in its impact, means that it's hitting each of us, that in hitting each of us, it will not hit us each in the same way. Of course, one's global location and class and caste matter, and so too does embodiment. On this point, we can note that in Amitav Ghosh's 2016 piercing analysis of climate change and its provision for the unthinkable, his book is called The Great Derangement, there is global and Asian-specific sense of energy flows, of colonial and capitalist ordering of the environment into derangement, and yet the nodal points of energy, people. People as embodied beings barely figure, disabled people, not at all. Like Ghosh, social science climate change research includes disability, if at all, as a health variable. Gregor Wolbring in Canada has been writing about this as well. But this is far different, including disability as a health variable or something to think about in escape protocols, is far different from regarding disability experience as revelatory of the limits of current Western conceptions of the weather or current Western conceptions of the environment. And still, we journey. We journey even though no one can expect to finish with their bodies intact, and no one can simply make a plan, watch the forecast, put it into a 3-minute report, and come through unscathed. The body and the weather both exceed and underwhelm any and all of our more rational plans. And this is why we need to find better ways to imagine how the body and the weather belong or are together. Those of us in disability studies are not, of course, the first to suggest that there must be better ways to think the weather in relation to a failure of empathy indicative of our sense of collusion. Consider this September 7th, 2018 email sent to BBC administrators, sent from the administrators to BBC journalists. Dear all, after a summer of heat waves, floods, and extreme weather, environment stories have become front of mind for our audiences. There are a number of important related news events in the coming months, including the latest report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Green Great Britain Week in October. So there will be many more stories to cover. Younger audiences in particular have told us that they'd like to see more journalism on the issue. With this in mind, we are offering all editorial staff new training for reporting on climate change. The 1-hour course covers the latest science, policy, research, and microconceptions to challenge, giving you confidence to cover the topic accurately and knowledgeably. Please book now by choosing a session, and you can get more information. The memo goes on. In the meantime, you can read Climate Change for BBC new crib sheet and the analysis and research website by searching climate change, which covers the basics. I hope you find this useful. End quote. The training suggested, among other things, that balanced reporting on climate change would no longer need to include the climate change deniers. People, especially young people, have accused the mass media of producing a false balance by constantly including the climate change deniers. While this false balance may be rectified, the assumptions that enacted balance as primary remain, and other forms of false balance do so now as well. The constant inclusion of a concern for accurate, technical knowledge on the climate, shoring up where the boundary line between weather and climate should be drawn, similar to the demand to draw lines between impairment and disability, all in a 1-hour handy training session, makes for its own sense of false balance, as well as its own sense of false security. We collude. I I guess I'm suggesting that sometimes in doing 1-hour training sessions, we collude with the production of a false balance when we act as if it is simply clear, accurate knowledge that stands between us and a more livable future. These distinctions between impairment and disability, or between weather and climate, or between facts and understanding, are not given to us by ever more accurate knowledge, proof, evidence. These distinctions are themselves sense-making devices given by our cultures. They are knots of taken-for-granted answers to questions about how to live and who we are. The problem, in other words, is not knowledge. The problem is one of understanding within community. Or as Kevin Love suggests, the problem is how to commit ourselves, in his words, to an intergenerational obligation to be the community of the question. End of his words. It also puts me in mind of Kirsty Lerdiard's work with Dan Goodley and Catherine Runswick-Cole, where research communities, it was not research for the sake of information, it seemed to be research oriented to community, and I think that changes what research does. In the face of strange weather and disabled experience and staggering collective failures of empathy, this is very difficult to be a community of the question, especially while climate change deniers are still included and disabled people or disability experiences are not. Weather, climate, impairment, disability, any of these issues cast as mere border-drawing moments make for imbalances that dissuade us from considering a more pressing truth. The feel of the weather, of drops of rain, hitting different people differently, signaling the need to be more awake to imagining both an embodied and an unworlded way of being in community. More information is not what is necessary, nor is psychological revelation. As Paul Gilroy insists when speaking of Fanon and the colonized and colonial subjects, this is not an information issue. This is a call, in Gilroy's words, to, quote, commit acts of imagination, end quote, and do something other than draw our knowledge boundaries or merely know something more about the different feels of the weather. Also, I'm reminded of Vic Finkelstein. I think he published the article in Tom Shakespeare's first Disability Studies Reader back in 1998. And he was talking about how the sense of vulnerability under knowledge regimes of modernity, all of the sense of vulnerability got put onto disabled lives, and knowledge gave people a sense of being without vulnerability. And so this divide gets between the vulnerable and those who are not vulnerable, and those who have the knowledge and get to sort of proceed. And I think that that sense of a false sense of security or certainty between a divide between vulnerability and not vulnerability is part of the knowledge production that has gone into our current weather climate crisis. But you might want to think about what Vic Finkelstein said back then a bit better than I am right now. Like any forecast, knowledge needs to be overtaken by judgment, a calculating prediction, which most certainly needs to be in tune with intergenerational obligations to allow the questions that animate community to continue to exist. The nexus of strange weather then represents an issue of awakening collective imagination, of how our taken-for-granted relations to vulnerability leads to splits, as Finkelstein has depicted. Depicted as in the know or out of it, while never touching on whether from our being embodied beings together, but in very different ways, offers the Cartesian false balance of disembodied knowledge. Ironically, this may be the way of knowing and the kind of knowledge that got us into this problem in the first place. Servicing a bioeconomic representation of man, big M man, suggests Sylvia Winter, has led to his overrepresentation as the only real form of humanity, that we only have truth or the reality when we're talking about bioeconomic versions of life. That might be part of the problem, leaving many not only outside of contending with the rising waters and drops of rain, but also without space to say what this means. Still, we need to imagine the body and the weather together, since we've all come too far to turn around. Given that our weathered bodies have already begun this journey, we need to think about how we have come this far, which means contextualizing what we know and how our knowledge is an embodied event. Kyle White, speaking from his position within the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, says, and that's now also on the screen. He says, quote, "Ironically, I have not yet seen any settler American or Canadian offer an imagined projection of climate future that is more ecologically dire than what Indigenous people have already endured due to colonialism. Our peoples who relocated to Kansas and Oklahoma in the 19th century, many Indigenous people have already experienced the irreversible collapse of their ecosystems. They have forever lost relationships with hundreds of species. They were forced to ration the commodity foods available to them, separated from their kinship and family relationships, and faced threats to their linguistic and knowledge systems. Of course, all the while, it was the settlers who believed that they, the settlers, were morally superior while oppressing Indigenous peoples." End quote. It's a call to see how we have imagined where crisis begins. White suggests that the white settler colonial sense of impending climate crisis participates in what Frazee has just taught us about, might also call a staggering failure of empathy, and thus knowledge about climate crisis may not address the crisis, but instead participate in its ongoing perpetuation. Knowledge, then, comes with its own form of collusion, which we can sense through its failures of empathy. How we currently make sense of the weather and our bodies, and have already established boundaries of community, has everything to do with the crisis we are already living. Again, a catastrophic failure of empathy points to a collusion with the powers that be, and the reproduction of more of the same. This does not mean to suggest that empathy is the solution. It's only to suggest that its failure is a methodological moment. The failure of empathy has something to teach us, especially as it pertains to disabled people not mattering in climate discussions. Arguing for clearer boundaries between strange weather events and climate change, or for more proofs, findings, and even making worldwide authoritative declarations of the actual arrival of the crisis, may do little else than repeat forms of knowledge that have led to this state of affairs. The crisis, for example, reframed as an economic one, may do little else than privilege an economic perspective above all others. Luckily, we need not be schooled in environmental science in order to move into new relations to how we are weathered beings. In this sense, a cultural or critical disability studies can follow some of the lessons of Indigenous peoples and reconnect to what our current stories, including scientific reports on weather change, as well as helpful pamphlets and one-hour seminars, are doing to our embodied and enworlded relations. I turn again to some thoughts from people from Turtle Island. In Anishinaabe Bemoan, says Mea Chikabi, and Mea, I'm Mea's supervisor, but Mea is an ongoing teacher of traditional stories and also Anishinaabe ways of thinking and philosophizing in my life. In Anishinaabe Bemoan, says Mea Chikabi, Atisokan, so that's spelled A-A, well, the spelling changes, but A-A-T-I-S, or sometimes D-I-S, O-K-A-N, Atisokan, or Atisokan, meaning traditional story, is rooted in the word tis, or dis, which means an umbilical connection to the source of existence. And it's also rooted in the word can, K-A-N, meaning an artificial construct made for a certain purpose. So traditional story then can be thought of as her words, a device created for the purpose of connecting us to the source of existence. Or is one way we could or should orient the telling of strange weather stories. So you might think back to the BBC memo and think that can't possibly be a traditional story. No. But we could listen to the umbilical connections that the BBC story or the training program, what is it trying to connect us to? What traditions is it trying to enforce as giving us life? And it might turn out that some of those umbilical connections are toxic. So this sense of a traditional story, this sense of connectivity, can also be a way to re-encounter or listen to what we experience in everyday life, especially the stories that connect people to the powers that be as a source of existence in a disembodied and bureaucratized way of knowing that always comes with its catastrophic failures of empathy that collude in power's reign. An umbilical connection to the source of existence means treating disability and the weather as an occasion to reveal modern commitments that ground our perception of problems as part of the problem. Thus, to continue in the tradition of working at the intersection of embodiment and the environment is a way to construct a disability studies forecast, a judgment of what we take to be knowledge of the strange weather nexus, judging the kinds of knowledge we are provided with, the kinds of stories. One way to do this is to seek out the failures of empathy as signs of collusion with a version of strange weather that is so certain of its future that it does not attend to the other sorts of communities our weather talk has already made and has already relied on. We need to figure out and forecast our umbilical connections these weather stories tie people to. Again, seeking out failures of empathy as signs of collusion is not to suggest that empathy is the way, the truth, and the light, but is merely a method for gathering signs necessary to consider what strange weather narratives are doing, how they make bodies matter, and in so doing, make other matters disappear. How much time have I taken so far? Has anybody done the time?
It's 5:11.
Yeah, what does that mean?
41,
There's 20 minutes left, including the questions.
20 minutes.
20 minutes left, okay. I'm going to skip this. I put up some quotes about how disability studies, Hemingway and Priestley, back in 2006, had started to make the connection between the social model of disability as being understanding disability as created by society, how that is caught up with also beginning to understand climate change as created by society. Both sharing the sense that disability and the climate are situated to, are vulnerable to not being understood as social. And that's why we need to keep mentioning, oh, this is social, this is social. But even as we mention this is social, we still end up depicting both the climate and disability as one, not good, and two, should be otherwise. So it was a way to try and show that disability studies has been thinking about climate change for a while, and we need to keep doing that, and at the same time question how our depictions tap us into a version of disability and the climate that needs to be reconsidered. I think, so our vulnerability to naturalization was the point of those quotes, which I'll give you at some other time if you'd like. I'm going to move ahead though, and to David Anderson, who's in the room, wrote a review of a book called, which you mentioned in your talk, I think. Is David Anderson here? Ah, hello. So you reviewed a book called Disability Studies in the Environmental Humanities Toward an Eco-Crib Theory. And David, by the way, I don't know if you remember saying this, but you raised a question that I think is really helpful to us. Anderson asks, quote, What is to be gained by considering the environment when conducting research that prioritizes disability experiences and communities, end quote. He goes on to suggest that what is to be gained must be something more than knowing that this is human-made and not good, in that it is oriented toward, quote, relationality and the mutual vulnerabilities of bodies and ecological worlds that cannot and should not be reduced to illogical definitions of abnormal and unnatural, abnormal, normal, and natural, unnatural, or easy acceptance of understandings of the meaning of loss, end quote. Considering this alongside our staggering failures of empathy, as these point to our collusion, requires engaging vulnerability as it appears and disappears within strange weather narratives. So as a way to follow through on Anderson's invitation to avoid illogical definitions of abnormality or the natural, unnatural, while also regarding stories as forms of connection to tricky powers we may not yet understand, as Jacobi suggests, I'm going to return to the short story passages that I began with. So this short story has a character who never receives a name. With all his middle-aged knowledge as a forester and little that impresses him these days, our lead character himself, hiking on the mountain trail of El Tishushi, moving toward the Moraine waterfall. He is seeking a hidden house and a mysterious woman that his buddy, Stu, had told him about. On his trek, slipping in the rain and losing his glasses, quote, everything looked covered in film of oil, end quote. Nonetheless, he finds many things. A tiny endangered tree frog, the daub and wattle house, and he spots the woman he was searching for. But just as he does, something rolls out from under his boot. It was a skull, the skull of a child, coated in soot. The rain remains a selfish, indiscriminate creature in the forest. It is a cage, his words. In the rain, and now in fear, he tries to escape that which he had hoped to find and rockets through the bushes, slipping once more. He says that his boot got caught in a tendril and sent me tumbling again. The resounding crack, not of a bush branch, but as he first thought, but of himself, is so sharp that it causes him to look at his fallen self. A bone is sticking out of the flesh of his right leg. Strangely out of place, his leg bone looked like plastic. Whereupon he also notices that in this fall, he has crushed the rare, tiny, golden tree frog. He passes out. When he comes to, his walking stick is now splintering his broken leg. He is immobile in the daub and wattle house, the very idea of which had initially provoked this hiking adventure. The woman and her people in the hidden forest house plan to get him out of the forest and to help. They do get him to the forest edge, but they remain behind as they are waiting for the second coming. As the main character leaves the forest, so too does knowledge of these people. He carries out his story of them back to Stu and his other buddies. With this, there is a second coming, so to speak, since a transformative power does hit the family, but not as the reader may hope. Upon telling this story to his buddies, who tell it to their wives, who tell it to the social workers, who tell it to the media, the whole Forrest family comes under the gaze of the state and is separated by court actions into foster care, and the father figure is jailed. Not another word is said about the rain, the forest, nor his broken leg, nor the endangered and now dead tree frog. Disability studies has taught us how to both perceive and read such a story. The environment can cause impairment, and depending on one's reaction and the reaction of others, can make for disability. Injured in relation to both the rain and his fear of the environment, this character becomes completely debilitated by his focus on the injury, perceived also in relation to the symbolism of death, or what Leonard Davis has characterized as the memento mori, the disability is the memory of death, which you could read the tree frog as. With this, the lead character faints. Injured and devastated, his body is overtaken by the powers that be, namely those who splint his leg and move him into their shelter and eventually get him out of the forest. Responded to by others, he is now captured by their sense of his injury and by their sense of what care will look like. Once he moves out of the forest, any mention of his debilitation disappears, incorporated as he is into the larger structures of control and care, many of the same ones that take control of the forest family's life as well. But there's more. In the face of strange and ever stranger weather, there is continuance from that which has been created, both disability and the weather. After all, the story lives on now in many different versions with us. These continue in relation to each other and serve to awaken a sense of mutual vulnerability. I think reading that the bone from his leg looked like plastic is a reminder of that kind of mutual vulnerability. The people who live in the hidden forest house, who get the man out of the forest, become part of a wider network of stories, and their health and their lives are subject to a staggering failure of empathy, since seemingly everyone colludes to move them into structures of state control. In the face of larger power structures, the stage is set to forget about weather and the body. Information is gathered, understanding is not. With this staggering lack of empathy, all become lost to a concern for what to do. The irrationality of waiting in the forest for the second coming of Christ becomes the sole focus. Their apparent abnormality becomes the nodal point of everyone's interest, including that of the state. So completely decontextualized from the strange weather nexus of embodiment and the environment does the lead character become, that a reader might be inclined to forget the drop of rain that had hit his nose, just as the story of a mysterious forest woman had hit his imagination. Rare is it to notice failures of empathy, which could point us toward a mutual vulnerability. Instead, there is the powerful sourcing of existence in knowledge and control. Instead of considering what is animating our relations to strange weather, we typically receive tips on how to manage a future crisis or how to measure our failure to do so. For example, governments around the world are now offering tip sheets for what to do if you find yourself in a natural disaster and you encounter a blind person, another pamphlet for a deaf person, a person with an assistance animal, a person who needs medication or a wheelchair, etc. Or there's more bureaucratic cost-benefit discussions of disaster response protocols and the allocation of resources. How should disabled people fare when there are limited resources? Should the ventilator be taken from the disabled person and given to the soldier? Or there are signs that we have simply gone too far with the advent of climate grief, which has been characterized as, quote, that gut punch that you get when you realize your imagined future may not exist anymore, when you realize that what you've done to the planet will not make tomorrow look like it did yesterday, end quote. Economic rationality, combined with a sense of disability as a form of biological lack, leads to disaster protocols, action plans, and crisis management that make us all vulnerable to thinking about human frailty in ways that simply confirms the status quo, a sense of the wrongness of being that reproduces a bioeconomic way of knowing as if that's reality itself. What is needed instead is engagement with the stories that already root us into what is regarded as the source of our existence, things like biology and the economic. Disaster protocols, action plans, and crisis management are stories that sometimes decimate our more complicated underpinnings in intergenerational obligations to each other as weathered beings that could connect us to what our communities need to question. Disability experience is that drop, that, as Schildrick says, that tear, that rip, that crush, that oily look around us, which could remind us to make forecasts in relation to the stories of embodiment and enworldedness that have already preceded us, have already sent us on this path. A disability studies forecast is one that can pause and lean into what has already been narrated, what has already been said about who we are and what we should do. This backward recollection suggests the need to grapple with those tricky umbilical connections to sources of existence that we now know are toxic. Most importantly, a bioeconomic version of being. A disability studies forecast is one which can engage the narratives we are already subject to as a way to try and open an escape hatch from bioeconomic reasoning. I've suggested that attending to the failure of empathy is one such method of this opening. Deciphering what has been normalized and enabled when living in cities with cars, a massive industrial production process. The question is, how do these powers weave themselves into our lives as disabled people, such that we feel the drop of rain hit our nose as our own personal adventure, and yet are kept from locating that drop of rain in the wider social context? This is not to say that the drop is made and not natural, or vice versa. It is to say that what we have made with the drop of rain, and what it makes of us, even if indiscriminate and unequal, needs to be considered in non-prepackaged ways. The weather's power is undoubtedly material, concrete, real. Yet the real of the weather, when confined within scientific forecasts of climate change, does not fully engage what weather means as we make sense of our lives, plan, and carry on in the midst of strange and ever stranger weather. Much like the drop of rain on misted vision can generate second thought, we can explore the complexity of disability experience with its form of second thought regarding the cultural blend of current weather narratives. Second thought, doubling back, is a dangerous journey as it moves us away from the more empirical questions of whether or not the weather matters as climate change, and moves us more towards the symbolic, that is, the meaning of who the human must be, or what power must be, such that we are in the trouble we are in. By drawing out the interpretive complexity between narrative expressions of embodiment and the weather, we might experience second thought that potentially reveals some of the grounds of disciplinary knowledge about our beings in crisis, or being in crisis. The hard work of the politics of understanding, I'm borrowing that from Hannah Arendt, the hard work of the politics of understanding ourselves as embedded and embodied beings requires much closer attention to the stories that we are in, given the stories that we're now telling. Thanks a lot.